Pulmonary circulation. The lung has two types of circulations: a high pressure, low flow circulation that supplies systemic arterial blood to the trachea and the bronchial tree, and a low pressure, high flow circulation which supplies venous blood, because low pressure, venous blood from all parts of the body to the alveolar capillaries where oxygen is added and CO2 is removed. The pulmonary artery and its arterial branches carry blood to the alveolar capillaries for gas exchange, and the pulmonary veins then return the blood to the left atrium to be pumped by the left ventricle through the systemic circulation. Coming to the physiological anatomy of the pulmonary circulatory system, the pulmonary artery extends only 5 centimeters beyond the apex of the right ventricle and then divides into the right and left main branches that supply blood to the two respective lungs. The pulmonary artery has a wall thickness of 1/3 of that of the aorta. The pulmonary arterial branches are short, and all the pulmonary arteries, even the smaller arteries and arterioles, have larger diameters than their counterpart systemic arteries. So larger diameters, 1/3 thickness of that of the aorta, and short arterial branches. These combined with the fact that the vessels are thin and distensible, it gives the pulmonary arterial tree a large compliance, a large distensibility, averaging almost 7 ml per mm of Hg. This 7 is a magic number in this entire chapter that pertains to pulmonary circulation. We'll see why that is soon. Averaging almost 7 ml per mm of Hg, which is similar to that of the entire systemic arterial tree. This large compliance allows the pulmonary arteries to accommodate the stroke volume output of the right ventricle. Coming to the bronchial vessels, blood also flows to the lungs through small bronchial arteries that originate from the systemic circulation, amounting to 1 to 2% of the total cardiac output. This bronchial arterial blood is oxygenated blood, in contrast to the partially deoxygenated blood in the pulmonary arteries. It supplies the supporting tissues of the lungs, including the connective tissue, septa, large and small bronchi. After this bronchial and arterial blood passes through the supporting tissues, it empties into the pulmonary veins and enters the left atrium rather than passing back to the right atrium. Therefore, the flow into the left atrium and the left ventricular output are about 1 to 2% greater than that of the right ventricular output. Coming to the lymphatics, lymph vessels are present in all the supportive tissues of the lung, beginning in the connective tissue spaces that surround the terminal bronchioles, coursing to the hilum of the lung and then mainly into the right thoracic lymph duct. But particulate matter entering the alveoli is partly removed by way of these channels, and plasma protein leaking from the lung capillaries is also removed from the lung tissues, thereby helping to prevent pulmonary edema. Coming to the pressures in the pulmonary system, when we talk about the pressures in the right ventricle, see the pressure pulse curves you can see here. Okay, coming to the aortic pressure curve, it's shaped like an A. Okay, and then you have a similar curve here. The systolic pressure in the right ventricle of the normal human averages about 25 mm Hg, and the diastolic pressure averages about 0 to 1 mm of Hg. And these values on the right for the right ventricle are 1/5 of that of the left ventricle. So as you can see here, left ventricle the values are 120 by 0. The right ventricles are about 1/5 of it, that is 25 by 0. Okay. Coming to the pressures in the pulmonary artery, as we already know, the pressures in the pulmonary artery are 25 by 8, systolic is 25 mm of Hg, and diastolic is 8 mm of Hg, with a mean pulmonary arterial pressure of 15 mm of Hg. Coming to the pulmonary capillary pressure, the mean pulmonary capillary pressure is about 7 mm of Hg. 7, as I said, is a magic number. We came across 7. It was the compliance of the bronchial compliance value of the bronchial pulmonary vessels. And also now it is the mean pulmonary capillary pressure. Now coming to the left atrial and pulmonary venous pressures, the mean pressure in the left atrium and the major pulmonary veins averages about 2 mm Hg in the recombinant human being, varying from as low as 1 mm of Hg to as high as 5 mm of Hg. It is usually not feasible to measure a human being's left atrial pressure using a direct measuring device, because it is difficult to pass a catheter through the heart chambers into the left atrium. However, the left atrial pressure can be estimated with moderate accuracy by measuring the so-called pulmonary wedge pressure. This measurement is achieved by inserting a catheter first through a peripheral vein to the right atrium, then to the right side of the heart, and then through the pulmonary artery into one of the small branches of the pulmonary artery, and finally pushing the catheter until it wedges tightly in the small branch. The pressure measured through the catheter, called the wedge pressure, is about 5 mm of Hg. Okay. So that is the left atrial pressure, which measures about 5 mm of Hg. That is a wedge pressure, okay? Coming to pulmonary vascular resistance, the pulmonary vascular system has thin walls and less smooth muscle as compared to the systemic vasculature. These vessels offer much lower resistance to blood flow than the systemic arterial vessels and are also more compressible and have more compliance as compared to the systemic arterial vessels. So, since the pulmonary circulation is closely associated with the alveoli, it is influenced by alveolar and intrapleural pressures, which can change dynamically. Therefore, the pulmonary vascular resistance is influenced not only by the smooth muscle tone of the pulmonary vasculature but by other forces as well. The pulmonary vascular resistance can be calculated by using this formula derived from Poiseuille's law, Q, that is flow, equals pi delta p r power 4 by 8 eta L. And if you take all this except the delta p as the denominator, that equals resistance. So Q is equal to delta p by R. Okay, pulmonary vascular resistance is equal to input pressure minus output pressure, that is the pressure gradient delta p by blood flow Q. Okay, so where input pressure is the mean pulmonary arterial pressure, output pressure is a mean left atrial pressure, and blood flow is the cardiac output. Although pulmonary vascular resistance is extremely small under normal circumstances, it can become even lower if the pressure within the pulmonary circulation increases. So this is accomplished by two mechanisms, recruitment and distension. In recruitment, capillaries that are normally closed up, they open up due to the increased pressure, thereby lowering the pulmonary vascular resistance. This is called recruitment. As you can see here, capillaries that were normally closed, they also open up because of the increased pressures. Coming to distension, capillaries distend and accommodate more blood as pulmonary vascular pressures increase. This is called distension. See, what happens is they distend more the already opened capillaries in order to accommodate the blood flow due to increased pressures, thereby decreasing the resistance. Okay. And coming to blood volume of the lungs, the blood volume of the lungs is about 450 ml, about 9% of the total blood volume of the entire circulatory system. Okay, approximately 70 ml, again 7, we have 7 here. 70 ml of this pulmonary blood volume is in the pulmonary capillaries, and the remainder is divided about equally between the pulmonary arteries and the veins. Coming to the blood reservoir function of the lungs, they serve as a blood reservoir. Under various physiological and pathological conditions, the quantity of blood in the lungs can vary from as little as 1/2 the normal up to twice the normal. Okay, so loss of blood from the systemic circulation by hemorrhage can partly be compensated for by the automatic shift of blood from the lungs into the systemic vessels. Coming to cardiac pathology, it may shift the blood from the systemic circulation to the pulmonary circulation. Left heart failure or increased resistance to blood flow through the mitral valve in the left heart as a result of mitral stenosis or mitral regurgitation, it causes blood to dam up in the pulmonary circulation, sometimes increasing the pulmonary blood volume to as much as 100% or twice the normal and causing large changes in pulmonary vascular pressures. Coming to the blood flow through the lungs and its distribution, blood flow through the lungs is essentially equal to the cardiac output. So that is why the factors that control cardiac output also control pulmonary blood flow. Under most conditions, the pulmonary vessels act as distensible tubes that enlarge with increasing pressure and narrow with decreasing pressure. Okay. So coming to this mechanism, decreased alveolar oxygen reduces alveolar blood flow locally and regulates pulmonary blood flow distribution. See, when the concentration of O2 in the air of the alveoli decreases below the normal, especially when it falls below 70% of the normal, below 73 mmHg of PO2, the adjacent blood vessels, they constrict with vascular resistance increasing more than 5 O2 levels. This effect is opposite to the effect observed in systemic vessels, which dilate in response to low O2 levels. Although the mechanisms that promote pulmonary vasoconstriction during hypoxia are not completely understood, low O2 concentration may stimulate the release of vasoconstrictor substances or decrease the release of a vasodilator such as nitric oxide from the lung tissue. Some studies, however, suggest that hypoxia may directly induce vasoconstriction by inhibiting some oxygen-sensitive potassium channels, so O2-sensitive K+ channels in pulmonary vascular smooth muscle cell membranes. So with low partial pressures of oxygen, these channels are blocked, leading to depolarization of the cell membrane and activation of calcium channels, causing influx of calcium ions. The rise of calcium concentration then causes constriction of the small arteries and arterioles. The increase in pulmonary vascular resistance as a result of low O2 concentration has the important function of distributing blood flow where it is most effective. So, because if some alveoli are poorly ventilated and have a low O2 concentration, the local vessels constrict because you don't want to waste blood flow through a region where oxygenation is not happening. You can instead redirect that blood flow into an alveoli which actually is being which is actually adequately oxygenating the blood. Okay, so this constriction causes the blood to flow through other areas of the lungs that are better aerated. Now, coming to the effect of hydrostatic pressure gradients in the lungs on regional pulmonary blood flow. Blood pressure in the foot of a standing person can be as much as 90 mmHg greater than the pressure at the level of the heart. This difference is caused by hydrostatic pressure, that is by the weight of the blood itself in the blood vessels. In the upright adult, a pressure difference of 23 mm of Hg exists between the apical regions and at the base about 15 mm of Hg, which is above the heart, and 8 below. You can remove the values like this. As I said, 7 is a magic number, so 15 minus 8 gives you 7. Okay, 7 2s are 14 and 14 is closely related to 15. Okay, 14 plus 1 and 7 plus 1 is 8. So 15 mm of Hg is above the heart and 8 is below the heart. The pulmonary arterial pressure in the uppermost portion of the lung of a standing person is about 15 mm Hg less than the pulmonary arterial pressure at the level of the heart, and the pressure in the lowest portion of the lungs is about 8 mm Hg greater. Such pressure differences have profound effects on how blood flow occurs through the different areas of the lungs. Okay, so this you can understand in this curve right here, which depicts blood flow per unit of lung tissue at different levels of the lung in the upright person. Okay, and after this, coming to the zones of blood flow, the lung is often described as being divided into 3 zones, and in each zone the patterns of blood flow are quite different. Okay, so therefore at any time the lung alveolar air pressure, the capillaries in the alveolar walls are distended by the blood pressure inside them, but simultaneously they are compressed by the alveolar air pressure on their outsides. Therefore, at any time the lung alveolar air pressure becomes greater than the capillary blood pressure, the capillaries close and there is no blood flow. Okay, you can see that in this diagram here. Okay, now there are 3 zones. Remember it like this. In zone 1 there is no blood flow, zone 2 has intermittent blood flow, and zone 3 has continuous blood flow. In zone 1 there is no blood flow during all portions of the cardiac cycle because the local alveolar capillary pressure never rises higher than the alveolar air pressure during any part of the cardiac cycle. So in zone 1 the alveolar capillary pressure never rises more than the alveolar pressure, so it is always closed and no blood flow occurs. Okay, you can remember the pressure differences like this: avi, and then keep shifting this to the right, avi, and ava. Okay, like this. And in zone 2 there is intermittent blood flow only during the peaks of pulmonary arterial pressure because the systolic pressure is greater than the alveolar air pressure, but the diastolic pressure is less than the alveolar air pressure. So when systole occurs, there is an increase in pressure, so the pulmonary capillary pressure rises and alveolar capillary pressure rises, blood flows, and in diastole the opposite happens. And in zone 3 there is continuous blood flow because the alveolar capillary pressure remains greater than the alveolar air pressure during the entire cardiac cycle. Normally, the lungs have only zones 2 and 3 of blood flow. Zone 2 intermittent blood flow in the apices, and zone 3 continuous flow in all the lower areas. Okay. For example, when a person is in the upright position, the pulmonary arterial pressure at the lung apex is about 15 mmHg less than the pressure level at the heart. Therefore, the apical systolic pressure is only 10 mm of Hg, that is 25 at the heart minus 15. So this 10 mm of apical pressure is greater than the zero alveolar air pressure. So blood flows through the pulmonary apical capillaries during systole. Conversely, during diastole, the 8 mm diastolic pressure at the level of the heart is not sufficient to push the blood up to the 15 mm Hg hydrostatic pressure gradient required to cause diastolic capillary flow. Therefore, blood flow through the apical part of the lung is intermittent with flow during systole but cessation of flow during diastole. This is called zone 2 blood flow. Zone 2 blood flow begins in the normal lungs about 10 centimeters above the mid-level of the heart and extends from there to the top of the lungs. In the lower regions of the lungs, from about 10 centimeters above the level of the heart all the way to the bottom of the lungs, The pulmonary arterial pressure during both systole and diastole remains greater than the zero alveolar air pressure. Therefore, continuous flow occurs through the alveolar capillaries or zone 3 blood flow. Also, when a person is lying down, no part of the lung is more than a few centimeters above the level of the heart. In this case, blood flow in a normal person is entirely zone 3 blood flow, including the lung epiphysis. Okay, just go through this diagram once. Now, zone 1 blood flow, it only occurs under abnormal conditions. It means that no blood flow at any time during the cardiac cycle. It occurs only when either the pulmonary systolic arterial pressure is too low or the alveolar pressure is too high to allow flow. One instance is when in an upright person whose pulmonary systolic arterial pressure is exceedingly low, as might occur after severe blood loss. And exercise, it increases blood flow through all parts of the lungs. A major reason for increased blood flow is that the pulmonary vascular pressures rise enough during exercise to convert the lung epiphysis from a zone 2 pattern to a zone 3 pattern of flow. Now, coming to increased cardiac output, it is normally accommodated during exercise. It is normally accommodated by the pulmonary circulation without large increases in pulmonary artery pressure. During heavy exercise, blood flow through the lungs may increase 4-fold to 7-fold. This extra flow is accommodated by the lungs in 3 ways. The first step is by recruitment. It increases the number of open capillaries as much as 3-fold. Second step is by distension, by distending all the capillaries and increasing the rate of flow through each capillary more than 2-fold. And the third step is by increasing the pulmonary arterial pressure. Okay, as you can see here. So normally the first two changes decrease pulmonary vascular resistance so much that the pulmonary arterial pressure rises very little, even during maximum exercise. This effect is shown here. The ability of the lungs to accommodate greatly increased blood flow during exercise without increasing the pulmonary arterial pressure, it conserves the energy of the right side of the heart and prevents the development of pulmonary edema. Coming to the function of the pulmonary circulation when the left atrial pressure rises as a result of left heart failure. Remember one thing, pulmonary edema, in 90% of the cases, it is caused by left heart failure. Okay, in majority of the cases, not just 90%. The left atrial pressure in a healthy person almost never rises above plus 6 mm of Hg. Let's just, revise the graph of these pressures. So as I said, pulmonary capillary pressure, pulmonary artery pressure is 25/8. Okay. So the mean is 15, and these values, they keep pulsating till it reaches the pulmonary capillary pressure of 7, which is a magical number. And then at the left atrium, you have a pressure of about 5. Okay. So like this, it keeps decreasing till the level of 5 or 2. Okay. So this is the graph. And so the left atrial pressure in a healthy person almost never rises above plus 6, even during the most strenuous exercise. When the left side of the heart fails, however, blood begins to dam up in the left atrium. As a result, the left atrial pressure, it can rise on occasion from its normal value of 1 to 5 mm of Hg all the way up to 40 to 50 mm of Hg. The initial rise in atrial pressure up to 7, again magical number, has a little effect on pulmonary circulatory function. However, when the left atrial pressure rises to greater than 7 or 8, further increases in left atrial pressure cause almost equally great increases in pulmonary arterial pressure, thus causing a concomitant increased load on the right heart. Any increase in left atrial pressure above 7 or 8 increases the capillary pressure equally as much. When the left atrial pressure rises about 30, causing similar increases in capillary pressure, pulmonary edema is likely to develop. Coming to pulmonary capillary dynamics, alveolar walls are lined with so many capillaries that in most places the capillaries almost touch one another side by side. Therefore, it is often said that the capillary blood flows in the alveolar walls as a sheet of flow rather than in individual capillaries. Coming to pulmonary capillary pressure, no direct measurements of this have been made. However, isogravimetric measurement has given a value of 7 mm of Hg, magic number again. Okay. Now, coming to capillary exchange of fluid in the lungs and pulmonary interstitial fluid dynamics, the pulmonary capillary pressure is low, about 7 mm of Hg, which in comparison with a considerably higher functional capillary pressure in the peripheral tissues of about 17 mm of Hg. The interstitial fluid pressure in the lung is slightly more negative than in the peripheral subcutaneous tissue. The colloid osmotic pressure of the pulmonary interstitial fluid is about 14 mm of Hg, 7 2s are 14, in comparison with less than half this value in the peripheral tissues. The alveolar walls are extremely thin, and the alveolar epithelium covering the alveolar surfaces is so weak that it can be ruptured by any positive pressure in the interstitial spaces greater than alveolar air pressure, which allows dumping of fluid from the interstitial spaces into the alveoli. So now let us see how these quantitative differences affect the pulmonary fluid dynamics. So if you look at this diagram, this explains everything. So coming to the outward and inward forces, the capillary pressure, it is about 7 mm of Hg. It causes fluid to move outside. Coming to interstitial fluid colloid osmotic pressure, 7 to 14, you can remember it like this. It is a pulling force, colloid osmotic pressure. So it pulls fluid from the capillaries into the interstitium. So it is about 14 mm of Hg. And there's also a negative interstitial fluid pressure of 8 mm of Hg. Remember it as 7 plus 1. So 7 plus 14 plus 8 gives you a total outward force of 29 mm of Hg. Whereas there is only one force that causes absorption of fluid into the capillaries, which is the plasma colloid osmotic pressure. It equals 28 mm of Hg. That it is the total inward force. So the total outward force minus total inward force gives us 29 minus 28, or a mean filtration pressure of 1 mm of Hg. This filtration pressure of 1 mm of Hg, it causes a slight outflow of blood from the capillaries into the interstitium. Okay, so into the interstitial spaces, and except for a small amount that evaporates in the alveoli, this fluid is pumped back to the circulation through the pulmonary lymphatic system. Negative pulmonary interstitial pressure and the mechanism for keeping the alveoli dry. See, what keeps the alveoli from filling with fluid under normal conditions? See, the pulmonary capillaries and the pulmonary lymphatic system normally maintain a slight negative pressure in the interstitial spaces. It is clear that whenever extra fluid appears in the alveoli, it will simply be sucked mechanically into the lung interstitium through the small openings between the alveolar epithelial cells. The excess fluid is then carried away through the pulmonary lymphatics. Thus, under normal conditions, the alveoli are kept dry. Coming to pulmonary edema, it occurs in the same way that edema occurs anywhere else in the body. Any factor that increases fluid filtration out of the pulmonary capillaries, or that impedes pulmonary lymphatic function and causes the pulmonary interstitial fluid pressure to rise from the negative range into the positive range, will cause rapid filling of the pulmonary interstitial spaces and alveoli with large amounts of free fluid. The most common causes of pulmonary edema are left left-sided heart failure, or mitral valve disease, with consequent great increases in pulmonary venous pressure and pulmonary capillary pressure and flooding of the interstitial spaces and alveoli. Damage to the pulmonary blood capillary membranes caused by infections such as pneumonia, or by breathing noxious substances such as chlorine gas or sulfur dioxide gas. Okay. Coming to both of these aforementioned mechanisms, they cause rapid leakage of both plasma proteins and fluid out of the capillaries and into both the lung interstitial spaces and the alveoli. Coming to the safety factor, experiments in animals have shown that pulmonary capillary pressure normally must rise to a value at least equal to the colloid osmotic pressure of the plasma inside the capillaries before significant pulmonary edema can occur. Therefore, in the human being whose normal plasma colloid osmotic pressure is 28 mm of Hg, one can predict that the normal pulmonary capillary pressure must rise from the normal level of 7 mm of Hg to more than 28 mm of Hg to cause pulmonary edema, giving an acute safety factor against pulmonary edema of 21 mm of Hg, 28 minus 7. Coming to the safety factor in chronic conditions, when the pulmonary capillary pressure remains elevated chronically for at least 2 weeks, the lungs become even more resistant to pulmonary edema because lymph vessels also expand greatly, increasing their capability of carrying fluid away from the interstitial spaces, perhaps as much as 10-fold. Therefore, in patients with chronic mitral stenosis, pulmonary capillary pressures of 40 to 45 mm of Hg have been measured without the development of lethal pulmonary edema. Coming to rapidity of death in persons with acute pulmonary edema, when the pulmonary capillary pressure rises even slightly above the safety factor level, lethal pulmonary edema can occur within hours or even 20 to 30 minutes if the capillary pressure rises 25 to 35 mm of Hg above the safety factor level. Thus, in acute left heart failure, in which the pulmonary capillary pressure occasionally does rise to 50 mm of Hg, death may ensue in less than 30 minutes from acute pulmonary edema. Coming to the effect of ventilation perfusion ratio on alveolar gas determine the PO2 and PCO2 in the alveoli, the rate of alveolar ventilation and the rate of transfer of O2 and CO2 through the through the respiratory membrane. The assumption is that all the alveoli are ventilated equally and that blood flow through the alveolar capillaries is the same for each alveolus. However, even normally to some extent and especially in many lung diseases, some areas of the lungs are well ventilated but have almost no blood flow, whereas other areas may have excellent blood flow but little or no ventilation. In either of these conditions, gas exchange through the respiratory membrane is seriously impaired, and the person may suffer severe respiratory distress despite both normal total ventilation and normal total pulmonary blood flow, but with the ventilation and blood flow going to different parts of the lungs. Therefore, a highly quantitative concept has been developed to help us understand respiratory exchange when there is imbalance between alveolar ventilation and alveolar blood flow, and this is called the ventilation perfusion ratio. In quantitative terms, the ventilation perfusion ratio is expressed as VA by Q. When alveolar ventilation is normal for a given alveolus and blood flow Q is also normal for the same alveolus, the ventilation perfusion ratio is also said to be normal. When the VA is 0, yet there is still perfusion of the alveolus, the VA by Q is 0. Or at the other extreme, when there is adequate ventilation but 0 perfusion, the ratio VA by Q is infinity. At a ratio of either 0 or infinity, there is no exchange of gases through the respiratory membrane of the affected alveoli, which explains the importance of this concept. Therefore, let us explain the respiratory consequences of these two extremes. Okay, you can see that in this figure. Okay. So coming to alveolar oxygen and carbon dioxide partial pressures when VA by Q equals 0. See, when VA by Q equals 0, it means that blood flow is occurring. The alveoli are being perfused but not ventilated. Okay, so what does this mean? Therefore, because the blood that perfuses the capillaries is venous blood returning to the lungs from the systemic circulation in order to be oxygenated, it is the gases in this venous blood with which the alveolar gases equilibrate. So that is why when VA by Q equals 0, the normal venous blood we know has a PO2 of 40 and PCO2 of 45. Therefore, these are also the normal partial pressures of these two gases in the alveoli that have blood flow but no ventilation. Whereas when VA by Q equals infinity, that is, the alveoli are being ventilated but they are not being perfused, there is no blood flow. What happens is, what happens is, instead of alveolar gases coming to equilibrium with the venous blood, the alveolar air, it becomes equal to the humidified inspired air. That is, the air that is inspired loses no oxygen to the blood and gains no CO2 from the blood. Furthermore, because normal inspired and humidified air has a PO2 of 149 and PCO2 of 0, these will be the partial pressures of these two gases in the alveoli. So coming to gas exchange and alveolar partial pressures when the ratio is normal. When there is both normal alveolar ventilation and normal alveolar capillary blood flow or perfusion, the exchange of O2 and CO2 through the respiratory membrane is nearly optimal. And alveolar PO2 is normally at a level of 104 mm of Hg, which lies between 149 and 40. Likewise, alveolar PCO2 lies between two extremes. It is normally 40 in contrast to 45 in venous blood and 0 in inspired air. So under normal conditions, the alveolar air PO2 averages 104 mm of Hg and the PCO2 averages 40 mm of Hg. You can see the diagram here on which both the extremes have been plotted. Okay, so for example, when VA by Q equals infinity, that is at this end of the curve, 0.1 represents the inspired air, okay, with PO2 having 149 mm of Hg and PCO2 having a value of 0 mm of Hg. And at the other extreme, we have the point here where the ratio is equal to 0, and this is a plot of PO2 and PCO2 when the ratio equals 0. The PO2 is 40 and the PCO2 is 45. And this is a normal point where PO2 is 104 and PCO2 is 40. This diagram, it gives the range of all possible values, okay, for PO2 and PCO2 and for the VA by Q ratio. Coming to the concept of a physiological shunt when VA by Q is below normal, see, whenever the ratio is below normal, there is inadequate ventilation to provide the oxygen needed to fully oxygenate the blood flowing through the alveolar capillaries. Therefore, a certain fraction of venous blood passing through the pulmonary capillaries does not become oxygenated. This fraction is called shunted blood. Also, some additional blood flows through the bronchial vessels rather than through the alveolar capillaries, normally about 2% of the cardiac output. This too is unoxygenated shunted blood. The total quantitative amount of shunted blood per minute is called the physiological shunt. This physiological shunt is measured in clinical pulmonary function laboratories by analyzing the concentration of O2 in both mixed venous blood and arterial blood, along with simultaneous measurement of cardiac output. You can calculate that from the following equation, where the physiological shunt blood flow per minute is equal to the ideal initial concentration of oxygen in the arterial blood minus the measured concentration of oxygen in the arterial blood by the ideal concentration of oxygen in the arterial blood minus the measured concentration of oxygen in the venous blood times the times the cardiac output per minute. Okay. And coming to this point, the greater the physiological shunt, the greater is the amount of blood that fails to be oxygenated as it passes through the lungs. There are certain disorders that cause a physiological shunt. These include PAEP, that is mnemonic PAEP, or pulmonary embolism, atelectasis, emphysema, and pneumonia. Coming to the concept of physiological dead space, when the ratio is greater than normal, when ventilation of some of the alveoli is great but alveolar blood flow is low, there is far more available oxygen in the alveoli than can be transported away from the alveoli by the flowing blood. Thus, the ventilation of these alveoli is said to be wasted. The ventilation of the anatomical dead space areas of the respiratory passageways is also wasted. The sum of these two types of wasted ventilation is called the physiological dead space. This space is measured in the clinical pulmonary function laboratory by making appropriate blood and expiratory gas measurements by using the following equation called the Bohr equation, which says that the physiological dead space is equal to the tidal volume times the partial pressure of CO2 in the arterial blood minus the expired partial pressure of CO2 by the partial pressure of CO2 in the arterial blood. Okay. So when the physiological dead space is great, much of the work of ventilation is wasted effort because so much of the ventilating air never reaches the blood. Coming to abnormalities of the ventilation perfusion ratio, see, there is an abnormal VA by Q in the upper and lower normal lung. In a normal person in the upright position, both pulmonary capillary blood flow and alveolar ventilation are considerably less in the upper part of the lung than in the lower part. However, the decrease of blood flow is considerably greater than the decrease in ventilation is. Therefore, at the top of the lung, VA by Q is as much as 2.5 times as great as the ideal value, which causes a moderate degree of physiological dead space in the area of the lung at the apices. At the other extreme, in the bottom of the lung, there is slightly too little ventilation in relation to the blood flow, with VA by Q as low as 0.6 times the ideal value. In this area, a small fraction of the blood fails to become normally oxygenated, and this represents a physiological shunt at the bottom of the lung. In both extremes, inequalities of ventilation and perfusion decrease slightly the lung's effectiveness for exchanging O2 and CO2. However, during exercise, blood flow to the upper part of the lung increases markedly. So far less physiological dead space occurs, and the effectiveness of gas exchange now approaches optimum. Coming to abnormal VA by Q and chronic obstructive lung disease or chronic obstructive disease, COPD. Most people who smoke for many years, they develop various degrees of bronchial obstruction. In a large share of these persons, this condition eventually becomes so severe that serious alveolar air trapping develops, with resultant emphysema. The emphysema in turn causes many of the alveolar walls to be destroyed. Thus, two abnormalities occur in smokers to cause abnormal VA by Q. First, because of many of the small bronchioles are obstructed, the alveoli beyond the obstructions are unevenly unventilated, causing a VA by Q that approaches zero. Second, in the areas of lung where the alveolar walls have been mainly destroyed but there is still alveolar ventilation, most of the ventilation is wasted because of inadequate blood flow to transport the blood gases. Thus, in chronic obstructive lung disease, some areas of the lung exhibit serious physiological shunting and other areas exhibit serious physiological dead space. Both conditions tremendously decrease the effectiveness of the lungs as gas exchange organs, sometimes reducing their effectiveness to as little as 1/10 of the normal. In fact, this condition is the most prevalent cause of pulmonary disability today.